Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
All right. Hope everybody's doing okay. Um, and Want to start with just a friendly reminder that 2 weeks from today, we won't be meeting. So that's the Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend. I figure that people are probably going to be busy with family or traveling or any number of things. So I figured that we can do without for that particular Sunday. So anyway, so we'll be doing this week, next week, and then we'll skip November, I guess, 30th. And then and then we'll keep going from there. Um, anything anything pending, anything you want to ask about previous topics? I know we were talking about prayer last time. Anything that you're wondering about for the time being?
I have a question. I don't know where it falls into our previous discussions,
Mhm.
but Chabad put out a notice that they're going to have kosher food delivered, I'm assuming from Atlanta, like once a
No,
month. And I
that's
went to
from New
uh,
Jersey.
okay, and I went to their website and I was looking, and they have a kosher fire extinguisher. What makes a fire extinguisher kosher? Or is it just they said it's kosher because?
Um,
Interesting.
I have never heard that.
Well, neither have
I
I.
It's
um,
one that doesn't work on the Sabbath.
There you go.
Maybe that's it. Yeah.
I,
Okay.
gue-
It's
I
from Wisconsin. Who
guess.
knows? It could be what they've come up with.
There,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm sure that since everything they sell is kosher, they probably just labeled it because they labeled kosher this, kosher that. Everything had kosher in front of it, but it was a kosher store, so I assumed. Okay, I just thought I
Right.
would ask. I laughed when I saw it, and thought that makes no sense to me.
What was it?
Uh,
Fire
Oh,
from Chabad.
yeah, yeah. Listen, it's yeah. What can I tell you? I don't know. I guess
Me,
the
me and the rabbi
observation I
Chabad
can make, and
fire.
this really is an observation about
should I turn the light on?
Chabad per se,
You
but
did come
rather it's an observation. I mean, just as a reminder that, kosher means that which is proper, right? So now, what would be improper about a fire extinguisher? Uh, I mean, the only thing to me that would be improper about a fire extinguisher is one that doesn't work, right? That would be
Yeah.
that would be not a great thing to have in your house if it didn't work. But other than that, I honestly don't see what the issue would be. So, um, eh, yeah, anything I would say beyond that would be just speculative. So, um, but I think that, yeah, that overall idea is something at least good to start with when we discuss the matter of keeping kosher, because what does kosher mean? I mean, kosher means that which is proper. So you will hear in the Jewish experience a number of different things that are listed as kosher that are not necessarily even food, right? But, like, so for instance, you'll hear about a kosher Torah scroll. You might hear somebody refer to that, right? A kosher Torah scroll. We do not eat Torah scrolls. You know that, right? Or I would hope you would figure that out, right? We don't eat Torah scrolls. But a kosher Torah scroll means a Torah scroll that is appropriate for use, right? I mean, it's been, written by a scribe, and it doesn't have any spelling mistakes or, things like that, right? That's a kosher Torah scroll, one that you can that one is valid for use, right? Um,
I mean,
so
do we have many kind of wipes?
yeah.
Hmm.
So anyway, so
Now, that was a rhetorical question.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Rhonda, do you know
What?
if we have any?
I don't
Okay.
know unless
Mar-
I can draw it,
So
because you wouldn't use, those cleaning wipes.
so anyway, we are
I
so
had a
yeah, so
question, Rabbi.
yeah, go for it. Please.
I'm sorry, I missed last week and I watched the video. What is the place for private reading of the Torah and prayer at your house? I saw last night, or I mean, I watched the video yesterday of the last week, so it talked about prayer and also prayer relating to the Torah. And I'm just asking about personal reading of the Torah. Is that something that's encouraged? And is that something you do on a regular basis? And is there a prayer that goes with that?
So so yes, I mean, so it's certainly, it's certainly a valid thing. I mean, prayer on one's own, prayer, or studying Torah, reading passages from the Torah, etc., are certainly, good and valid to do. Um, when we um, uh, the optimal circumstance, the way that we ought to be able to do things, hopefully, is to uh, do these things communally whenever possible, right? But it's not always possible, right? I mean, even those who might live in communities that have large Jewish populations, where you can gather people to, have a minyan, to have, 10 Jewish adults in a room. Uh, Sometimes just things happen, life happens, right? And you're not able to do that. Um, so prayer, just as a little review, when it comes to, praying on one's own, there are certain prayers that you omit. Um, like any of the Kaddishes, you don't say, right? Um, uh, Reciting the Amidah out loud, right? You don't do that without a minyan. You don't, and I think this is getting more to the heart of what you're asking about. You don't do a public Torah reading without a minyan. Now, can you? But when it comes to like the study of Torah, can be done regardless of the number of people. So um, there is a prayer that one often says before studying Torah, and at least part of it is the same prayer that one says when called up to say a blessing over the Torah in a service, right? The one that begins with Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, blessed are you, Adonai our God, sovereign of the universe, Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, right? Which is that you have chosen us among all people, v'natan lanu et Torato, and given us, the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah, blessed are you, giver of the Torah. Right? And as, of course, a reminder, the idea of chosenness, this I certainly, agree with the idea that chosenness does not mean we're any better than anybody else. It just means that we have been given a unique, a unique set of
Unique
responsibilities.
role.
Yeah, yeah, and that doesn't mean that that's qualitatively better than anybody else. So anyway, that kind of blessing is certainly fine, and yeah, you can study Torah uh, no matter what. There's actually in So if you see the Friday videos that I do for the synagogue, I'm going through passages from what's known as Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, which is what I like to call the earliest rabbis' greatest hits. It's their it's their most memorable teachings. And one of the things, I mean, I haven't gotten to this one yet, but one of the things it says is that um, what's the scriptural proof for that you ought to learn Torah if there are only 10 of you? And it gives a verse from the Tanakh that says why you know that. And how do we know that it's imperative to do so even when there are only 5 of you? How do we know even when there are 2 of you? How do we know even if there are 1 of you? Right? So uh, so the idea of studying Torah on one's own, it's optimal to do so in a group, but if you're on your own or if there's just a couple of you, that shouldn't stop you.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Oh, no problem. No problem. Anything else before we jump into Kashrut? And of course, if you think of something else, uh, like I said, tangents are they're generally a good thing. So, within reason, of course, but please do, if things occur to you, happy to entertain. Um, so I should note from the outset that when we talk about keeping kosher, right, the laws of kashrut, meaning, and usually keeping kosher most often does refer to dietary laws. I want for everybody to keep in mind that there are always degrees of keeping kosher. Now, I say that not to discourage you from pursuing more and more in terms of, in terms of these laws. But what I'm saying is that, especially when it comes to embracing the ideas of kashrut, um, it's not an all or nothing proposition, at least in dealing with the degrees in which to observe kashrut. This is something that should not be looked at as an all or nothing proposition. Um, One of the reasons why I say that is because, as I think will become clear, no matter how strict you might be, there's always going to be somebody who's stricter. You're always going to find somebody who, does it more stringently. So there comes a point in all this, and there comes a point in all this where it behooves us to say, you know what, I'm comfortable with where I am. Now, I'm not, and I'm not here to tell you what that comfort level is. I can tell you what I believe a proper comfort level is in terms of a kitchen in a conservative synagogue. That I feel like I can establish and, keep within reason. So I'm going to rely on that basic idea, sort of, a standard. But are there people who can keep it even stricter than that? Always. You're always going to find people who are going to be stricter than the next one. And at a certain point, you have to say, we're doing what we can. That's not to say that anything goes. Okay. This is not to say that, oh, do whatever you want. There is still the idea that there are still things that I would say that are generally agreed upon as this is okay, this is not. So we're going to go through some of those basic things and then kind of get into the nitty gritty. The first question that is often asked in terms of keeping kosher is why? And that's the hardest one. Because let's take a look at the origins of it all. Now, which is what I generally like to do. It's like, let's start with the earliest ideas, which of course come from the Torah. The earliest ideas of keeping kosher are found sort of sprinkled throughout the different books of the Torah. You have a little bit in the book of Exodus. You have a pretty substantial list in Leviticus and another one in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy repeats a lot of what's in Leviticus. So first of all, you have a principle. Okay, well, all right. So anyway, I need to get to the why part first. I'll tell about the principles in a moment. But regarding the why, there is no clear statement as to why you have to do this. At no point does God say, hey, I want you to eat this and not that because it'll be healthier for you, because it's a cleaner way of eating, because, don't eat these animals because I don't like those animals, or whatever it might be, right? There's no point where God says, you're doing this because. The closest we get to anything is at the end of Leviticus chapter 11, where after there's this exhaustive list regarding what you're supposed to, animals that are permitted to you and animals that are not permitted to you. There's a verse right near the end of that chapter that says, you shall be holy because I, Adonai, your God, am holy. So the idea of kashrut, of keeping kosher, has to do with the idea of we are emulating God's holiness. And again, it doesn't specifically say, oh, that's why you can eat these animals or not eat these animals. It's just sort of an aside. By the way, you should be holy because I'm holy. And so because they're right next to each other, we assume that that's why God mentions this at that point. But even that is kind of vague. All right, what is holiness? Holiness is kind of an abstract idea. But what I think we can say about holiness is that it means that it means to separate from that which is ordinary. You may recall that when we talked about Shabbat, about the conclusion of Shabbat, that we have a candle that has a bunch of different wicks. And we light that candle because it's supposed to be a representation of both Shabbat and the rest of the days of the week. And at that moment, when Shabbat ends at Havdalah, we say a blessing, which is Hamavdil ben Kodesh Lechol. We thank you, God, for making a separation between that which is holy and that which is ordinary. So holiness can be understood as being special. It can also mean, and this is the term I usually prefer, separation or distinction. We are staying, separate from other ways of being. We are maintaining our uniqueness. And there are going to be times, I'm sure, when anyone on the journey of keeping kosher might be doing one of the very particular rules having to do with dietary laws and saying to themselves, how in the world is this making me more holy? Why in the world does this, it feels so arbitrary? And it does feel arbitrary sometimes. I've got to admit, it does. But one thing I will suggest to you is that there is something, I don't know if you want to call it calming or reassuring or any number of things. There's something really lovely about the idea that every time we open our mouths to eat something, we are thinking about what God expects from us. We are staying grounded in terms of our responsibilities to be a unique people. That doesn't mean that just because one keeps kosher, that necessarily means that it guarantees that they live an ethical life, right? It doesn't mean that at all. But hopefully, with the idea that we are trying to get closer to godliness by keeping kosher, we are hopefully being closer to godliness. We will be closer to godliness. We will motivate ourselves to be closer to godliness in other aspects of our lives. That's really what it comes down to, at least in my way of thinking. You might have other reasons why you want to keep kosher, and they're probably not wrong, right? Um, but over the centuries, people have suggested other reasons. They'll say, oh, well, keeping kosher is healthier. Can I tell you? Not necessarily. You can eat perfectly kosher food and, you know, first of all, overdo it in terms of eating, and also just, you know, there's plenty of not particularly healthy things about keeping kosher, potentially. There were some who made the arguments that, well, it's cleaner. I have seen some kosher kitchens that are beautifully clean. I've seen others, not so much. Is there more washing of clothing, more washing of food in a kosher kitchen? Yeah, in general, yeah. But that doesn't mean everything's clean.
Yeah.
So it's not about cleanliness. It's not about health. It's more about this idea of uniqueness.
Is it correct to say it's tradition?
Yeah, I mean, tradition certainly is part of it. Now, just because something is tradition doesn't mean it's necessarily always the right thing, right? But I would also say that, but yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I mean, certainly at this point, it's it's part of our tradition. So yeah. Um, okay, so those are some of the why. And if you have any questions or do you have any questions or thoughts about that? I guess in a sense, yeah, everybody kind of has to come up with their own why when it comes to keeping kosher. I can suggest, but there is something very tangible about engaging in something uniquely Jewish. And by doing so with our food, it's a good way to keep our Jewishness very much present in our day-to-day decisions. Okay, so going back to what the Torah says about this all. So, first of all, you have a statement that appears several times in the Torah, which every time it appears, it generally seems to be sort of an aside, kind of like an oh, by the way. And it's a singular statement, which is, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. By kid, we're not speaking of a human child, of course. We are talking about,
Goat.
we're talking about an animal. Just to be clear, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk.
Can I just say something here?
Yeah, go for it.
I know there was back in the day they did boil everything in milk probably because there was no water, very
Mhm.
little water. I get the whole meat and milk thing. We don't mix. I mean, we have gone through different levels of kashrut here, but anyway, never mix meat and milk. And I understand. I get that. It would be the idea of boiling like a kid in its mother's milk is disgusting. But why the chicken in milk? Chickens don't give milk. They're not mammals. So how did that come about?
Um,
Or am I getting
no,
ahead here?
no. Just remind me to come back to that because
Okay.
I absolutely want to address that.
All right.
No, but you know what? It's a very fair question, and honestly, it's one of the questions I feel like I get pretty often these
I'm sure
days.
you do. Yeah.
In
Yeah.
English, a kid, as far as I know, strictly refers to a baby goat,
Yeah.
not any other animal. Is that what the Hebrew says? A goat?
Yeah.
Young, or but was it got expanded to, cows and everything else too?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
did that
So
happen?
it's well, yeah. I mean, well, so I will get to that. Lo teveshel gedi b'chalevimo. I mean, so yeah, don't, like if you are familiar with the song the Passover Seder called Chad Gadya, which means referring to a goat, which is a whole other story. But anyway, but yeah, we're talking about a goat. So yeah. Um, so yes, I will get to how that got extended. But so for now, I just want to talk about like specific things the Torah says, and then move on to implications for that. All right. So we have this idea: do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Then in Leviticus chapter 11, we go through a fairly substantial list of what we are allowed to eat, of animals that we are allowed to consume and animals we are not allowed to consume. Now, we know from the time of Noah, right? And this is before the giving of the Torah. We're talking about, early on in the book of Genesis. We know from the time of Noah that you are not supposed to eat the blood of an animal. That's a fairly clear thing, from there. When you talk about certain animals, right? They say, okay, you can, when it comes to eating, for instance, birds, the Torah essentially makes a list. These are the birds that you can't eat. And it just lists a bunch of birds. Doesn't really say why, but these are the birds that you can eat, these are the birds you can't eat. So that one, it's just, okay, here's a list. When it comes to mammals, The mammals you're allowed to eat have to have two qualifications. First of all, they must have a split hoof, and they must be animals that chew its cud. They chew their cud. Those are the mammals you're allowed to eat. Then, when it comes to marine life, if you will, the marine life you're allowed to have must have fins and scales. So using those qualifications, when you think of foods that I would say are kind of like famously not kosher, meaning foods that you will commonly find in, just foods that people commonly eat that are, according to these qualifications, not kosher. That's where you get, for instance, that the pig is not allowed to be eaten, right? So no pork. That's where you get the idea that shellfish, right? So the idea of like eating, shrimp or lobster or oysters or, from there. Those are things that those are things that are not permitted. This, of course, is not, that's not exhaustive, but those are some of those are the biggies, if you will, right? Those are some of the really um, major items that we're talking about. So I do want to address vegetarianism and veganism for a moment. Now, um, when Adam and Eve are in the garden, God says, basically, the leafy things around you, that's what you have to eat. But you're not going to eat the animals. So Adam and Eve are told, all right, that you're supposed to be a vegan. Seems fairly clear. After the flood, 10 generations later, after Noah survives the flood, then that's when God says, all right, you can eat the animals, just not the blood. And not a particular part of the animal. Why the change? There are some who would suspect that, well, the major change between Adam and Eve and Noah is that somewhere along the line, God says, these people I've created, they're evil. We have to destroy them, except for the one who I guess is the least evil of them all, Noah and his family. And so after the flood is done, God says, okay, now that we're resetting humanity, I'm going to adjust a few things. And I think it is fair to presume that one of those things that needed adjusting was permissiveness having to do with eating animals. Meaning that, because I mean, listen, for those who are parents, you know that there are times when your kids rebel and say that you're being too strict on X, Y, and Z. Now, sometimes the proper response is to double down and to say, well, there's a very good reason why, and sorry, you're not going to do that. But there are other times where you honestly have to come to some sort of understanding, make some sort of deal with your kids. I think that's the reality of the situation. Where if your kids are saying this is too strict, this is too much, okay. What kind of, can we make something that's fair for everybody? Right? You send your kids to bed at 7 p.m. Your kids say, I don't want to go to sleep. And you realize it's going to be a fight every night. You come up with some sort of boundary. All right, 8 p.m., as long as you've done these other things, right? As long as you do these things, and as long as you come up with different ways as your child develops and as they can take on more responsibility. I can't help but think that that's the change. That's the logic behind the change that God makes. That it's a recognition of appetites that certain people have. Now, this is not, please understand in all this, I am not trying to advocate against vegetarianism or veganism, not in the slightest. But I think there is something to the logic of making certain allowances. Recognize there are some people who, really do desire the consumption of animals, and for God to essentially say, okay, you want to eat certain animals, you're going to do it my way. And from Noah's time to Leviticus chapter 11, the logic is that when God gives the dietary laws to the Jewish people, that this is a way for the Jewish people to, once again, take on a certain number of regulations that reflect the people's uniqueness. Do I think it is an imperative for us to eat meat? I do not think that's an imperative. And I would also suggest that there are many people who keep a vegetarian or vegan kitchen or choose to only eat vegetarian or veganism. And one of their motivations is it makes the whole keeping kosher thing way easier. I can't fault that logic. I do eat meat. I don't necessarily have to. I mean, in other words, I could probably, if you told me, okay, you can never have meat again, I'd survive. I'd be okay. But, I enjoy it from time to time, certainly. But those who are vegan, vegetarian, it's certainly okay. That in itself should not be a revelation. But there are those who have argued that in a future time, meaning in a time of messianic redemption, that we will go back essentially to the Garden of Eden. We will go back to everybody being vegan. As I say that, I can hear the voices of people that I know in my life who might say, if that's paradise, then I don't want paradise. I don't know the answer to that. And with everything having to do with just as with everything else having to do with conjecture, having to do with what life will be like during the Messiah, it's all conjecture. These are all guesses. Nobody knows for sure. Um, anyway, so I want to sort of throw that out. I will say that there are times when if you're trying to explain, like, or if you're trying to keep kosher or trying to at least observe some laws of kashrut in a communal situation, I gotta say there are times it's a lot easier to say I'm vegetarian rather than I keep kosher because keeping kosher is, means a lot of different things. Vegetarian, or certainly veganism, it's pretty straightforward. At least it's a lot more straightforward, I would say. So I want to address it as some of my best friends are vegan, so it's certainly all good. Questions up to this point?
I think one thing that I thought was interesting is that the idea of clean animals, Noah had to bring clean animals onto the ark. And so it's interesting, he must have known what those were, or God explained it and it's just not in scripture. But what do you think about that? I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But
Yeah, I mean, there's almost, it makes you wonder whether after the flood, God looks down at Noah and and probably says to God's self, wow, all those animals you were traveling with, you probably looked at a few of those and said, gosh, I could really go for some of that. Um, it's that's only a suspicion. I think, yeah, in terms of whether Noah like sort of understood, what's a clean animal, what's not a clean animal. I mean, I don't know. I mean, look, in terms of, look, there are a lot of, as one would say, a lot of logical plot holes in the story of Noah and the flood in terms of how Noah actually managed all of that. Traveling in the ark with all those animals. It's a celebrated story, partially because honestly, the story of Noah and the ark is one of the reasons why it's celebrated so much. I think is because um, it's really easy and fun in many ways to explain to kids. I think that's one of the reasons why that story has a lot of traction is that, you know, because what's one of the first things we teach our kids? It's the sounds that animals make. You know, we teach our kids very early on just how cool animals are. Um, so yeah, what in terms of what Noah understands and doesn't understand, it's hard to know. Um, and also one of the tough things about one of the ongoing challenges of deciphering the story is to what extent is Noah a really good guy, or to what extent is Noah simply the best of a bad lot? That's one of those questions that continually challenges commentators in Judaism, and I'm sure in other places as well.
I mean, I never really thought about it, but I mean, some of the animals were carnivores.
Mhm.
I mean, I never really thought about how he fed them because I always thought the story was kind of a fable almost.
Yeah.
I mean, the pigs, I mean, if only the animals survived that were on the ark, well, then they weren't all clean animals. You had pigs and you had everything, right? So
Right.
it's a little contradictory there, but
Yeah. Yeah. There are a lot of plot holes in that story.
that's all right.
So, which, by the way, is, I think, one of the reasons why, I mean, uh, there are very few things in which, I mean, in many ways, I mean, we talk about, the beginning of the Torah, but the beginning of Judaism is, starts with Abraham, right? It starts with Abraham and Sarah. And so, but those 11 chapters prior to that in Genesis, um, talk about sort of like, I mean, that preamble, I mean, you absolutely have to have it. I mean, it's absolutely necessary because it looks at just what the Torah thinks of humanity in general. Um, so, it's very rare that Judaism will really cite, um, at least in Jewish ritual, you're going to have very few citations of Adam and Eve and of Noah. There's very little that does that. One exception, by the way, is the Jewish wedding. The Jewish wedding speaks about Adam and Eve at some points. It's one of very few times where we cite Adam and Eve as sort of a basis of um, Jewish practice. So, a little trivia for you. Um, Anyhow, so that's what the Torah gives us in terms of dietary laws. Not very much, right? And just like with Shabbat, we go in our tradition from just a handful of bits of information in the Torah to a whole host of rules and regulations and practices. So there is a joke told that God speaks to Moses, and God says, Moses, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, oh, okay, so let's see. So that means that you can't, mix any kind of milk with any kind of meat, and you can't have chicken parmesan, and you can't. Blah, blah, blah. And God says, Moses, listen to what I'm saying. Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Oh, okay. So that means that, like, when you have, meat and then milk, you have to wait 6 hours before you have meat and then milk, and then you have to, Moses, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Oh, so okay, so you have to get, like, different pots and pans and dishes and flatware and all these different things for the meat, and you have to, like, two different sets, and you have to keep everything. All right, Moses, have it your way. That's the joke. Um, because the implication is that, God only says one basic thing, and then, or I mean, at least that particular principle, or, then lists certain animals and then doesn't give any more instructions. And so, it's easy to look at the way that kashrut is kept in modern society. And it's like, oh my gosh, have we gone completely bonkers?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
it just made me think of this. So many times, I mean, not now that my kids are grown, but so many times when they were growing up, I would be so angry and or frustrated. And I swear I could almost feel God tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "See how I feel with you?" So I think that's what you're saying with Moses. Am I right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess, it's like, and now, of course, I mean, again, the thing I told was a joke. I mean, but it's and there's no indication that Moses was the one who came up with all these extra provisions. But yeah, yeah. Um, you know, it- but I think behind this, behind the joke is, is an important idea, which is that, all right, we have to figure out what these rules really mean. What are the practical implications of these rules? Um, Now, when you talk about the separation between meat and milk, there are so many things that one has to think about. Now, the easiest way to do it is to have two of everything. And by two of everything, I mean everything, meaning two different kitchens, honestly. I mean, if you really wanted to separate it, you'd have two different kitchens.
There are people who kind of have two different, I have cousins, they've got, well, they aren't complete. Well, half the kitchen is meat, half the kitchen is milk, and then there's the parve section, and then Passover, I think, is in the basement. I don't know. I mean, they're separate stoves, separate refrigerator, separate everything.
Yeah,
They will not eat in my house anymore.
I
But
can't
anyways,
imagine having that much money to have all that separation.
sure,
yeah.
sure. And that becomes, and quite honestly, that's an issue. And uh, you know, the issue of money and the issue of space, right? Um, I live in an apartment. There's one kitchen, as you would expect in most apartments, right? Um, and even if one had the space in one's home to make two kitchens, I mean, how challenging is that? And how many have the resources for all those things?
I've been to a bought a house in Knoxville, and I'm not real sure which part was which, but they have a huge commercial kitchen. But I'm sure there's probably two of everything. And I'm not sure it was one side of the room or the other. 'Cause I didn't ask for a tour of the kitchen, but I mean it's huge. But I'm sure they're doing that there.
Sure, sure.
Yes,
Um,
they absolutely do. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, for a commercial organization that that keeps kosher, that's not unusual. But what I want to lead into, and this is what and this is part of what I want to get into next week, is these practical questions, which is that most likely you got one kitchen, most likely. And given that, how do you do all this? What are the practical ways that you keep kosher, that one keeps kosher? And there are a lot of tricks of the trade, if you will. Um, I what I'm hoping, if I can get myself together, is to either do like a video or photographs of things I do in my kitchen. Because I've got an apartment kitchen. Most apartment kitchens are not certainly as big as kitchens in people's, like if you own your own house. Usually, there's more opportunity to build out. An apartment, you kind of have what you have. So how does one do this? How does one do this with one oven, one refrigerator, freezer? How does, I mean, and what I want to assure you is it absolutely can be done, and it is done on a regular basis. It absolutely can be done. Um, and so I want to next time go through some of these practical concerns of how one keeps kosher on a day-to-day basis. We're probably going to have at least a couple more sessions on kashrut because explaining the practical concerns in terms of one's own home and also of how we manage being out in the world and keeping kosher. And there are certain things that I'm going to touch upon that I would say are unique to a conservative Jewish outlook, which is going to be, in some ways, certainly not all, but in some important ways, will be different than an Orthodox, a Chabad approach. I'm not trying to say one's better than the other, but I feel like as a conservative rabbi of a conservative synagogue, it's important for me to, explain some of why I do what I do, why the synagogue does what it does. Got time for another question before we go?
I liked
Okay.
your joke for the answer, but is that the answer? Is it how do we end up going from a goat's offspring and milk from a goat to where it is now? Or is that I, I don't think you can prove on your joke, but is that really the reason?
What I will tell you briefly, and I'll get into it a little more, is essentially there are, and this is a brief answer to the question of also chicken and milk, which is that certain like rabbinic law extended this idea from goats to really anything that would be considered flesh, would be considered, meat. Now, fish is a whole other story, but but anything that's sort of meaty, you know, becomes like becomes sort of like that, becomes like the goat that you don't mix in its mother's milk. Any other kind of meat, any other kind of, and that extended to poultry because of the likeness to it. And maybe you could say, oh, there's not much likeness. Well, apparently there was enough of a likeness to the rabbis to make that decision.
Well, I do have to say that if you've ever seen like free-range chickens or
Mhm.
eaten a free-range chicken, they're much darker and tougher than the kind of chicken we buy in this, like than Empire kosher chicken. So there could be, I did have a Reform rabbi in South Orange tell me once, it was because you couldn't tell if someone was eating beef or chicken because they looked very similar back in the day because of course they weren't chickens being raised in little cages, they were free-range chickens. So that to alleviate any confusion and so that nobody might think you were breaking the law, they extended it to chicken. But just saying. I don't
Yeah.
know.
No, no,
Maybe.
no. I think it's part of it. Yeah. Yeah. It's so many of the rules, and we'll get to this more, is the idea of you're trying to reduce confusion. You're trying your best to reduce confusion. So with that, I'll let you go, and we'll continue on this next week. I thank everybody for your attendance and attention and questions.
See
Thank
you
you,
next week,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.